I've been the beneficiary of charitable philanthropic giving for my entire life. I grew up in a home where both my parents worked, and my father worked for the electric company, but my mother was the church secretary. So a part of our household income was drawn from the donations that other church members made to the church. In college, I received scholarships from nonprofit organizations, grants from charitable endowments, and my entire grad school was a nonprofit private university. Of course, as a pastor, my salary has derived from donations, some of which have been gifts from charitable endowments. Even now, some of our largest donations to our church come from the mandatory distributions of endowments. By that, I'm saying if you've set up a charitable endowment, you have to distribute at least 5% of your holdings every year. And I know some of our gifts come when that 5% requirement comes around. You cannot donate $1 million to a foundation and just let it accumulate money without ever actually doing anything charitable with the money. But of course, 5% is a fairly low bar, isn't it? What is then done with the other 95%? The donor of $1 million gets to write off 100% of their donation, while as little as 5% of it will be given to a charitable cause that year. Now, today I'm delivering the first part of a two-part sermon about philanthropy. Next week, I'm going to talk about how much good is done from generous people's donations. But today I feel the need to talk about something that you may have never heard anyone talk about before, which is the downside of capitalism and tax avoidance that masquerades as philanthropy. Of course, we all hear about the huge foundations in the news that even though they're divorced, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation does innovative work in many charitable fields all around the globe. Most of those newsworthy efforts warm the cockles of my heart. Who doesn't love it when really rich, very smart people try to take on noble objectives without using any tax money to do it? What we almost never talk about is what they are doing with the money they are not distributing to philanthropic causes. Of the $50 billion in that foundation, most of it is invested in profitable stocks, at least some of which is earning money in very questionable fields. Buying Walmart stock, when most of us who are concerned about the wage gap, the distribution of slave manufactured goods, and the questionable aspects of Walmart's corporate practices, we try to avoid ever shopping there, let alone buying a couple of $1 billion worth of their stock. And even more complicated, there are those on the receiving end of the foundation's charity who have alleged that some of the healthcare products and devices promoted by the foundation actually end up enriching Bill Gates. Last summer, South African journalist Patrick Bond wrote that exploitation often comes to Africa disguised as charity, specifically because of Bill Gates' own orientation to profiting from false solutions instead of promoting serious solutions. Our tax system, which is intended to raise the money that it costs to have a government, to run a civilization, allows for deductions for those who are wealthy enough to make large donations to charities. By doing this, they are avoiding paying taxes that would normally have been collected to pay for schools, hospitals, roads, fire departments, our military, our national parks, and everything else that it takes to run a civilization, because we are entrusting them to do good things with that donated money. I don't want to complicate this sermon with too many charts and economic numbers, but please allow me to remind you that a third of the wealth in the United States is owned by only 1% of our population. A third of the wealth. And the lower half of our population economically only owns 2% of the wealth. The rich and the poor still pay the exact same sales tax rate when they go to the grocery store. They pay the same usage taxes, which is why any proposed federal flat tax to replace income tax is the most regressive form of taxation possible. So when you talk about who shoulders the nation's tax burden, you can't just talk about income tax. You have to look at sales tax and property tax and all of the other fees that are hidden in purchasing gasoline or buying tires for the car, and the subsidies that are given to certain industries that unequally serve the public's interest. Yes, the majority of income tax revenue comes from the most wealthy, but looked at as a whole, the poor are still carrying a disproportionate share of the load, in part because the wealthy can avoid paying taxes by making charitable donations. The tax dollars they do not pay then gets pushed off to the lower end of the income spectrum for people who don't make enough to deduct donations. Now, I'm not wanting to tar all such foundations with the same brush, and I don't even want to imply that the Gates Foundation is more harmful than it is good. I suspect that they probably do a lot more good than they do harm, but you can see the weakness of a tax system that tremendously benefits the rich at the cost of the poor and middle class. Warren Buffett, one of the richest people in the world, who also does a lot of philanthropic work, does donate billions of dollars to the Gates Foundation, but it deserves to be pointed out that Warren Buffett puts a condition on his gifts that every dime he donates has to be distributed within a year of the donation. Buffett doesn't want his money becoming part of the 95% that is invested by the foundation. And that, I believe, should be informative to the rest of us. If he knows that that's not a good deal for the tax system, the rest of us should be aware that we are getting mistreated. If our tax system allows you to deduct 100% of your gift, then the gift should go to good causes and not be primarily invested, perhaps in your own corporation's stock that benefits you directly, that too often becomes a form of exploitation masquerading as a charity. For many years, I served on the board of our local community foundation, which now manages more than $400 million. I resigned from the board when it became evident to me that the stated goal of the foundation, which was to provide grants to worthy nonprofit causes in our area, had become secondary to growing the holdings of the foundation. Because the larger the foundation, the more you can pay the staff of the foundation and the nicer building you can have. At one point in my tenure, a former member of my church had left $2 million to the community foundation as undesignated money, which is the money that we were able to use to help poverty programs and those that didn't have their own special funds, that had been set up to support their private charity. But the board decided to use that money to leverage new gifts. They told the existing special funds that if they donated $2, we would give them an additional $1 out of this pool of $2 million to go into their reserves. Well, we used $2 million of undesignated money to buy another $4 million of donations that was designated. Now, what they did was legal, but running the risk of overstating my case, everything that Hitler did during the Holocaust was legal. That just doesn't make it right. I voiced my objections to the use of these $2 million in that way, and yet when we voted, I was the only one who voted to keep it for what it was donated for, the benefit of the poor, while everyone else voted to use it as matching money to increase the foundation's holdings. Now, I get it. Every army's first objective is its own survival, I suppose. So the foundation was looking after their own future. but it wasn't right. They said nice things to me and about me as I left, the way you always do with preachers. They applauded my convictions while entirely ignoring the point. And again, let me emphasize my heartfelt belief that our community foundation does a lot of good work, just not as much as they could have if they would decide some of these gifts somewhat differently. I'm not saying that the board was evil, but I am suggesting that maybe it was evil adjacent. And I don't want to make that a public cause, but we should do better with our foundations. Still, I should qualify that by saying over the past 30 years, I've probably resigned from most of the nonprofit boards in town, except for the ones that would never let me on their board. And I am talking now specifically about our 2 regional hospitals. I've always found it to be entertaining when people advocate for taxing churches, that churches shouldn't be nonprofit, but they never seem to mention the nonprofit status of our hospitals, which are always busy buying up the most expensive pieces of real estate in the area, removing said properties from the tax roll to build more and more buildings to compete with each other, and paying their executives larger and larger salaries in excess of $1 million a year, which is, now that I think of it, probably why I was never invited to be a trustee at one of the hospitals. There are some pretty big churches around here, but compared to the hospitals, their tax scam hardly deserves a mention. However, religion has its own inside secrets. If you don't recognize it, this is the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. It's situated near the Smithsonian campus to give the impression that it is the same sort and quality of collection as you find in the Smithsonian. It is, however, not what it pretends to be. It is the brainchild of the very wealthy Green family, the owners of Hobby Lobby and other retail businesses. The very right-wing religious fanatics came up with this project and have leveraged it to gain notoriety in the religious world. Heck, the Greens even got a personal audience with the Pope, Pope Benedict, not our current Pope, who models himself after St. Francis. Benedict modeled himself after Christians who own private jets, but I'm going to leave that alone for now. The scholar the Greens hired to curate their acquisitions for their museum was a personal friend of mine, a top scholar who was uniquely equipped to be able to tell the difference between forgeries and actual ancient manuscripts that the museum wanted to acquire. To avoid possible litigation, I want to say very clearly right now that I don't know that what I'm about to describe actually happened. I'm just saying that our tax laws are written in such a messed up way that it could have happened. Again, I don't know that they did it, but as a hypothetical, the Green family might have located and purchased an ancient scroll from some obscure Middle Eastern monastery for, let's just say in round numbers, $100,000. And then they had that scroll appraised at a place like Christie's Auction House, and they appraised it for $10 million. Now, when they donate that in this hypothetical scenario, I have no idea if it ever happened, but if they donate this scroll to the Bible Museum, do they get to take a $100,000 tax deduction, what they actually paid for the scroll, or do they get to take a $10 million tax deduction? Now, if such a horrible thing had happened, the super rich family in question could avoid paying over $3 million in taxes, leaving that tax bill for you and me to pay. I'm not saying it happened, I'm just saying. Under the guise of evangelical Christianity, under the guise of open-handed philanthropic generosity, the wealthy can avoid paying millions of dollars in taxes, but then who does pay for the new roads, the schools, the veterans benefits, Medicaid, and park rangers? Now, I've taken you into the weeds today to tell you about an injustice that does affect you, and it affects you in your wallet, an injustice that I suspect most of you never knew about. and it is arguably unfair, if not unkind, to even tell you about something that you can't do anything about, except for the fact that you get to vote for the people who write the tax laws. And if you vote for people or parties that consistently write tax laws in a way that provides loopholes for the rich who shift their tax bill onto you and your children and your grandchildren, then, dear friends, you have no one to blame but yourselves. It is not new news that rich people can be greedy and that they will likely exploit every opportunity that they can legally get their hands on to avoid paying the freight for running our democracy. Our democracy, which, in fact, has allowed them to become obscenely wealthy. I'm not saying that we should eat the rich, I suppose, but I'm saying that we should fight against an unjust economy that famous Catholic workers advocate Dorothy Day describes, saying, "Our problems stem from our acceptance of this filthy, rotten system." So, dear friends, stop accepting this kind of exploitation as being inevitable. It isn't. To quote my favorite musician, Bruce Cockburn, we have to keep kicking at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. So don't vote for fascists, please. And don't shop at Hobby Lobby.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.